Hey, so you've made it. Welcome, of course, welcome. So, it is me, it is I, Jhonny Jhay. And today, yes, today it's particularly different. Today marks exactly 1 year since my last chemo infusion, as you might have heard already. 365, 366, leap year. Let's just go with 365. 365 days since I rang that bell. One full rotation around the sun since poison, basically, yeah, poison became medicine, and medicine became hope. Today marks exactly 1 year since my last chemo infusion on March 24th, 2025. A milestone that I'm choosing to celebrate not with champagne or fanfare, yes, with a little bit of dressing up, of course, but also with raw honesty through this video and through this podcast. After enduring FLOT chemo's brutal toll, neuropathy that still grips my right leg, the 85-ish% gastrectomy that pretty much rewired my entire life, the endless scans and labs, this chemo brain, hitting this anniversary feels like defiant victory, proof that I'm still creating, proof that I'm still breathing, and proof, more importantly, that I'm still pushing forward. So I wanted to take a moment and celebrate this. And initially, though, I did want to celebrate silently, kind of just keep it to myself. But I also wanted to make sure that I talked about this anniversary out loud, because I think days like this deserve language. They deserve reflection, they deserve honesty. And not because I want to stay stuck in the past, and also not because I, want this episode to be one long cry session, but because survival, deserves more than just a quick caption and like a smiling photo. It deserves a full story. It deserves, the hard parts and like the beautiful parts sitting in the same room as it is. And that's really what this episode is going to be. It's not just me looking backward. It's me taking this day and holding it up to the light. It's me saying, this happened. I lived it. Yes, it changed me, and it keeps changing me. And if I'm being real, that's part of why this anniversary matters so much to me. When you go through something like cancer, people celebrate the milestone, and they should, of course, because making it here, it is not a small feat. It is not casual, it's not guaranteed. But what does not get talked about enough is that the anniversary is not just a celebration. It is also pretty much a mirror. It brings up what you survived, it brings up what it cost, what is still hurting, and what you're still learning. And very much so, it brings up who you are now that the emergency part is over, but the aftermath is still very much alive. So today I want to do this right. I want to go ahead and talk about the day it all started. I want to talk about the diagnosis, the fear, the chemo port, the first round of chemo, the surgery, the second round of chemo, the hospitalizations, that hit me pretty much immediately. The way my body got pushed so far, the doctors were seriously talking to me about tube feeding because I was just so dehydrated and so malnourished. I want to talk about protonics, and how that helped me stabilize enough to get through, to get some ground back under me. Even though by that point my stomach had already been through so much damage. I want to talk about what surviving actually looks like when the cameras are off. The neuropathy, the chemo brain, the emotional damage, nobody knows what to do with. The friends you gain, the friends you lose, the new people that come into your life, the guilt, the gratitude, the confusion, the weirdness of trying to return to life when there really is no return, just reinvention. Because the truth is, I don't think this day is only about what I was able to beat. I think it's also about what I'm still carrying, and somehow it's about both without canceling either one out. So I still remember the beginning, in this almost cinematic way, except it really wasn't cinematic when it happened. There were no sudden plops to the floor and, people rushing to try to catch me. There were no ambulance sirens and speeding cars, through the night. All of it, it felt so surreal. It felt like reality had really bad lighting. It felt like the air had changed. Nothing crazy, all very subtle. I'd say even insidious. And at first, yeah, there were some signs, little things, things that kind of just felt off, things that didn't really look dramatic enough to announce what was really happening inside of me. And one of the most haunting parts, though, of all of this is that, in simple terms, what led to the discovery of this was something particularly very subtle itself. It was basically just two slightly different tones in my body. Not some big theatrical alarm, not some giant flashing warning sign, but enough of a difference for the biopsies to keep being looked at more closely. That was difference enough, though, for a full team of pathologists to really study the samples and go, hold on, there's something going on right here. Something is wrong. And then came the words that rearranged everything. Poorly cohesive gastric adenocarcinoma with signet ring cells. Even now, kind of saying that out loud feels pretty heavy. It sounds clinical, but what it meant in my life was very immediate and personal. Rare, aggressive stomach cancer. That was a translation. That's it. That was a moment where language stopped being such an abstract thing and started feeling more like a weapon. I remember hearing it and feeling like the room had lost oxygen. It's really strange how a diagnosis can make time split. There is life before hearing it, and then there's life after hearing it. And the version of me on the other side of either of those, on the other side of that sentence, did not really get to ease into anything. He had to move. He had to learn quickly. He had to become fluent in fear very quickly. And what I wish more people understood is that diagnosis day is not just one emotion, as many will know. It's not just sadness, it's not just panic, it's shock, disbelief, numbness, hyperfocus, dread, and this weird practical instinct and survival mode that kicks in when you are devastated but also suddenly asking logistical, logical questions because your life has just become a schedule of tests, calls, appointments, signatures, decisions, treatment plans. I remember feeling like my body had become a case file, a problem to solve, a battlefield with paperwork. And underneath all of that was me, me still trying to process that I had a rare and aggressive cancer living inside of me. But to get chemotherapy started, I first had to get a little thing called a chemo port installed first. It's this little device that they surgically place under your skin. It's connected to a major vein, so they can deliver chemo directly without, destroying your veins with repeated needle sticks. This was done on Monday, October 21st, and the procedure itself was very surreal. It was local anesthetic. I would be awake through the whole process, kind of staring very empty into the left side of the room. I'd feel some pressure, yes, and then all of a sudden, like liquid dripping down my neck and my shoulders. And then suddenly, I had this foreign object living inside of my chest. I remember looking down at it afterward. It's this small bump under my skin. It's right here. And this thing was going to keep me alive, But very honestly, it also made me feel like not entirely human. It made me feel somewhat like I was a cyborg, like I wasn't fully human anymore. I was like part flesh, part medical device, part emotional furball, a mutant of some sort, cobbled together by necessity and by science. And now, now that I've lost, significant weight, and I mean significant, this port protrudes even more. I can see it clearly through my skin. I can see it through my shirt a lot of times. And it's like a mechanical reminder that my body has gone through a crazy, crazy war. How about chemo day? Well, I don't think I'll ever fully forget that first day of chemo. It was October 24th of 2025, just 3 days after my chemo port got installed. I can still pretty much remember the taste of that day, the emotional texture of that day, the anticipation, the dread, the quiet in my head that was not peace, it was just that kind of silence that fear creates when it's too big to name. And there is no glamorous way to say it. It was absolutely terrifying. It was very surreal, It was also very lonely in a very specific type of way. Yeah, I had people around me. And even when people love you, there are just parts of treatment they cannot enter with you. They can stand near it, they can support you, they can hold your hand before and after, but there is a threshold you cross completely alone. And I crossed it. I sat there and let medicine enter my body, medicine that was meant to kill what was trying to kill me. And there is something so brutal, but also very hopeful about that at the same time. You know, that is one of the hardest things about chemo. It is healing through harm. It is rescue through damage. It's survival through suffering. You know, so the prep, for that first infusion, clinical, of course, very cold. They have to access a port with a very special needle, flush it with saline, check for blood returns to make sure that it's functioning properly. It's such a strange intimacy. Like nurses are handling this device that's literally inside of you, and you just kind of have to sit there and just take it. You just have to sit there and let it happen because your life literally depends on it. Then came like the pre-medications, the anti-nausea drugs, the steroids, a cocktail designed to make the main event slightly more bearable. And then the chemo itself. I watched the bag just hang there. This toxic clear liquid that was supposed to save me, poison as medicine, death as life. The irony wasn't lost on me, The emotions that first day were, oh God, they were everything all at once, fear, obviously, this primal terror of what this poison that could easily be confused with water, would do to my body, but also hope, lots of it, because this was the fight. This was the moment the fight was really starting. This was me saying, not today. Nope, not today, cancer, not today. Definitely there was grief too. Grief for the body I was just about to lose. For the hair, oh, my hair, that was about to fall out. For the person I was before, relatively carefree, well, not healthy, but stable-ish, I was taking for granted that my body would just work. And underneath it all, this strange particular numbness, like my brain just couldn't fully process the magnitude of everything that was going on. So it just kind of shut down, itself. It shut down the emotional processing center and went into autopilot mode. It went straight into survival mode. The infusion took hours. I sat in that chair, tethered to an IV pole. I was listening to the quiet hum of the machines, pretty much measuring a future none of us could really quite name just yet. And I'm going to say it, I was very lucky. I admit it. I was very lucky. I had a private room, with what I could bring 2 visitors at a time. And obviously, those very first 2 visitors was my mom. She was there, unmovable, my constant. My dad beside her, he was trying to breathe courage into the space between us. But in their eyes, I saw everything flickered at once. Fear, definitely love, a lot of doubt, defiance. They were all layered like light and shadow across the same face. Strength. It was very surreal. It was very surreal seeing the people that to me had always seemed invincible look so fragile, but so determined at the same time to remain strong for me. It really broke my heart, it really did. But it also, I think, it made my heart beat louder. It was particularly interesting though because that summer, things between us they weren't gentle. We were not on the best of terms. There were fractures that we hadn't named, distances that we hadn't admitted, disagreements that we didn't see eye to eye on how to fix. But then, there and then, suddenly, there was this other reality, sharp, undeniable, urgent reality. It arrived like a plot twist, and definitely nobody expected, and definitely nobody wanted. But it literally reordered everything. You know, these old arguments lost their teeth, they lost their validity. You know, the only thing that mattered was that we were there and then, there in that room facing the same storm. And outside that day, I remember my aunt and my cousin, they were waiting for me, and they waited for their turn to step into that small universe with me. They came in with jokes, with a lot of juicy gossip, stories, and even mismatched distractions, plenty of memes, and they were trying to pull me, even for a moment, away from the gravity of the situation, the gravity of that IV drip. And my grandma came too, quiet but steady, carrying decades of lived faith in the way she held my hand. Each of them brought very different kinds of light, and together they made the room feel less like a hospital and more like, in some strange kind of way, a sanctuary. And as the medication, just moved through my veins, though, I kept on thinking about the other patients I had seen coming in at check-in, faces in chairs, eyes on floors, hands in labs. I wondered about their stories. I still do. Were they, also staring at the ceiling, doing this silent math with their fears and their futures? Were they too trying to fold their panic into small, manageable corners, compartmentalizing just enough to get through this one day, this one bag, this one breath? And somewhere between the beeps and of the monitors and the slow drips of the IVs, it dawned on me, all of us there, we were all part of this quiet, haunted club no one wants to join, no one asks to join. Strangers bound, together by the same fluorescent lights, by the same antiseptic air, by relatively the same chemicals, threading their way into our bodies in the name of survival. And yet under all that fear, there was also something moving, a thin, stubborn current of hope. Just reminding us that as long as that medicine was flowing, possibility was very still alive in our veins. And then came surgery. Surgery happened on January 3rd, 2025. And then came surgery. Surgery happened on January 3, 2005. I remember it was a Friday. And the surgery, even the preparation up to the surgery, felt like another chapter entirely. By that point, I had already been emotionally thinned out by the diagnosis and the first rounds of chemo. And surgery, it pretty much arrived like this hard, undeniable escalation. It was no longer about just infusions and side effects. It was also about literally being cut open, and then about recovering, and then about pain, and then more pain, and then about waiting to see what came next. Surgery basically strips life down to its core, down to basics. Can you get up? Can you eat? Can you keep something down? Can you sit up? Can you lay down? Can you go to the bathroom? Can you make it through the day? It made my world very small for a while. And when your world gets that small, every tiny win matters. A little bit of food, a little bit of first liquids, because there were days that I just could not drink water. There were days I could not drink anything other than clear liquids, and then a little bit of mashed up food, a little bit of baby food, pretty much, then a little bit of energy, a little less pain, a little more strength. You learn how to start measuring victory very, very differently. But then came the other round of chemo. And that's where things got especially hard for me. I got hospitalized within the first week after starting that second round. Everything happened so fast. One day I was just not drinking too much water, and then within a couple of days, literally, I was in bed, fetal position, my back was hurting. I was literally crying of pain. At that second round, pretty much triggered me being so dehydrated, very malnourished, very weak. I was in a place physically where things felt very scary, in a very different way. There was this kind of weakness that feels like fatigue, and then there's this kind of weakness that feels like your body is literally giving up ground by the hour. And that was absolutely terrifying because I didn't know what was going on. And then back then, after going, straight into the ER and trying to figure out what was going on, the doctors, start seriously talking to you about tube feeding. Everything kind of just snaps into some sort of focus. It makes you realize how precarious things have become. I was trying to eat, but I just couldn't. I was trying to get enough food into me, and I just really couldn't. I was also trying to prove that I could do it, while my body was pressuring me to say, no, we can't. Like, we can't. It felt so weird, to feel like my body was feeling like it was failing every test. And I remember the pressure of trying to reach just 1,000 calories a day. That was it. You know, um, from the first day of surgery, I was around 220. And at that point where I was on the second round of chemo and going into the ER, I had dropped a lot of weight. I was down to, at one point, 170 pounds then. So things started to get very, very different. Everything, it sounds kind of basic when you say it like that, just 1,000 calories a day, but it didn't feel basic at all. It felt like a real full-time job with overtime. It felt like strategy. It felt like survival math. Every bite had weight. Every bit of intake really mattered. Calories mattered. Just get them from somewhere. Every day was pretty much a negotiation with my stomach, my appetite, my nausea, my fear, my exhaustion. And, you know, then came a tiny little pill, Protonics. It ended up helping me. Um, it just helped enough that, I started to stabilize. I was able to get finally some relief. No more back pains, no more pains itself in my stomach, no intense, I don't want to do anything, and I am very grateful for that, deeply, because it really helped. But I also know that by then my stomach, at least the healthy part of it, had already suffered so much. It had already been through too much. I remember my doctor saying, my surgical oncologist saying that when they took out that part of my stomach that had the cancer, it was very well bruised. He's like, and cancer did chemotherapy did its thing then, because clearly it killed the cancer cells needed, and it made me think. you know it went through so much already. The healthy part, now it's going to go through some more. And this is another thing that people do not always understand. Sometimes these treatments and the conditions that keep you alive still leave so much damage behind. Survival isn't always clean. It's not. Sometimes it's, if not most times, survival with collateral. And that is a part I keep coming back to on this anniversary. The collateral, the aftermath, the part after the crisis where nobody assumes, there's something wrong, and everybody just assumes that you are just happy to be alive, and now everything is supposed to make perfect sense. And don't get me wrong, I am very happy to be alive. I really am. And there are days where that lands in me with full force, and I almost feel stunned by the fact that I'm still here. But being grateful to be alive does not erase what surviving has done to me. It does not erase the physical fallout, and it definitely doesn't erase all of the emotional ones. My body still reminds me all the time. The neuropathy, it's still here. You know, some days I feel like buzzing wires under my skin, or like my nerves are speaking a language I just never asked them to learn, and I have to play catch up. You know, some days it's just pain, some days it's numbness. You know, some days it's tingling, some days it's both. Some days it's like a weird unreliability that makes me feel like I can't trust my own body the same way I used to. You know, the MRIs, the CT scans, the appointments, the ongoing conversations about how to manage it all better. It's all of that now is part of my life, you know. And even when treatment was over, the effects lingered, like echoes that never got the memos to leave, you know. And then there's the chemo brain part. I really need people to understand how real that is. Uh, I've developed a stutter, you know, the difficulty of retaining information, you know, losing my train of thought, feeling mentally slower on days when I knew I was very sharp, you know, feeling like my mind is moving slowly through the fog while the world expects me to be back at full speed. And then add ADHD to that, you know, it becomes exhaustion, you know, very exhausting, a very exhausting thing where I am already trying to manage attention, memory, regulation. Now I'm doing it on top of a chemo brain, you know, on top of a brain that just went through poison. You know, it's very frustrating. You know, it can honestly make me defensive. It can make me also feel very embarrassed. You know, it can make me feel like I'm on autopilot again, and really that scares me. It's honestly very scary because autopilot is not the same as healing. You know, sometimes autopilot is just a trauma response wearing productivity's clothes. You know, it freaks me out to know that I'm no longer as sharp and quick minded as I used to be, because what if this is permanent? You know, what if I can never be the same as I was before? You know, or maybe I can, but now it's just going to take me 10 times the effort to find myself back to me, you know? Or maybe I'm not supposed to be, you know, who I was before. Maybe now I'm supposed to be like my own poetic reminder of change itself, you know? It's been difficult, you know, to make peace with that. And I'm still learning. I really am. And also now I've been dealing with a certain condition where I found bumps on my body, bumps that move, you know, which is one more phrase I never expected I had to learn in my vocabulary, calcinosis cutis, you know. They're basically calcium deposits, you know, showing up where they shouldn't. You know, that means more tests, you know, it means more questions. It means more trying to figure out the root cause. You know, there have been elevated markers that kind of pinpoint in the direction of lupus, and the doctors are trying to understand what exactly that means and whether it means that, you know, I have it or I don't. You know, we're trying to figure out. You know, they're hopeful that it's not lupus, and I'm really holding on to that hope too. But uncertainty, you know, kind of has its own emotional tax. Just kind of like when my surgical oncologist said, I don't know how much stomach I'm going to remove until the date of surgery. You know, you're living every single day through the treatment, through chemo, like with such uncertainty, you know, and that is so emotionally taxing. You know, it's so hard living in the maybe, very hard. You know, it's a hard feeling like your body is still producing mysteries when you already tried to solve so many that last time. And I really think the emotional damage of cancer and treatment too, does not get enough attention. You know, people understand the visible things more easily. You know, the weight loss, the hair loss, the scars, the hospitalization, medical devices. You know, but the emotional damage, that's very slippery. It's a very slippery slope. It is grief, but without a funeral. You know, it is fear after the emergency. It is trying to pick up the feathers of a torn down pillow, you know, while the wind just keeps on blowing. You know, that is honestly what some of this has felt like, you know, like something ripped it open, and now I'm trying to gather every soft piece of myself back into some shape I can somehow still live in, you know. The emotional damage has also shown in relationships, you know, and I need to talk about that because it really does matter. You know, losing people is real, losing friends is real. It is painful. And it is also confusing. Sometimes people just disappear because they don't know how to act, they don't know what to say. Sometimes they back away because they're uncomfortable. Sometimes they treat you like you are too fragile to be around in real life. Sometimes they don't leave dramatically, they just slowly start becoming absent on purpose. And you notice one unanswered message at a time, the space in between, and there's something very deeply painful about that. There's something very deeply painful about almost dying and then finding yourself in the position of begging people to reconnect, begging people to hang out, asking for connection, trying to not feel like a burden, trying not to take the distance personally, even when it does feel personal and probably is. You Home has also been complicated. There are fundamental differences that make things a little bit more tense. When you're already carrying trauma, fatigue, medical anxiety, grief, tension, all of that stuff. It doesn't stay small. It grows teeth. It gets louder. It makes everything feel closer to the surface. And I have noticed that I can get defensive a little bit more than usual. I have noticed that I can shut down or kind of go into survival mode before I even fully understand what's happening. And I do not say that to shame myself. I say because it's true, and because I really want to do better. I want to catch that part of myself earlier. I want to be more present. I want to stop living like the next emergency is always right around the corner, even though my body has valid reasons to be expecting one. At the same time, I really want to be honest that, everybody, not everybody has left. Some new people have come into my life, and that matters more than I can explain. I don't want to keep the bits of, people around because, smiles still matter, presence still matters, but there are people who just make room for me, and who make me laugh, who check on me, who show up in ways that are quite genuine, quiet and genuine. And, a couple of people have been that for me. Not in a fairy tale way, not in a way that erases stress and complexity. It's in a very human way, you know. And that, in a way, reminds me that tenderness still exists, in a way that reminds me that I am still someone that can feel joy, someone that can see beyond the diagnosis, someone beyond my scar tissues and beyond all of the fatigue. About grief, I remember my friend Nico saying, it's not moving on, but moving with. And that really stuck. And I have to talk about work. I really do, because I really do not think enough people say this part out loud. Finding a job after cancer is very hard, It is hard in practical ways already, but with cancer, it's just harder. And it's hard in emotional ways too, financial ways for sure, in identity ways. There is a gap in my resume, and there is a question of how much to explain. People will say, oh, there's information on that. Well, yeah, okay. But there's also the fear of being seen as unreliable or risky. There is the truth that even when you want to move forward, your body and your brain will probably not function the way they used to. And then there is this pressure of needing income while also trying to be very realistic about the recovery itself. It can feel like life is asking you to sprint now right after you barely learn how to stand again. And that is where the square one feeling comes in. Honestly, sometimes it does not even feel like square one. It feels like starting over from less than zero, starting in the red, starting with debt in your body, debt in your energy, debt in your emotions, debt in your confidence, debt in your pockets, and that is scary. That can make everything feel like it's piling up against you. Because how are you supposed to begin again when beginning again already requires resources that you don't fully have? That is one of the most frustrating parts of survivorship. People congratulate you for making it. Oh, yay, congrats, and then the world still hands you bills, expectations, deadlines, and all of the ordinary pressures of life as if your entire existence was just not split open. And that's where things get a little bit complicated too, at least for me. That's where survivor's guilt comes in, and that's very real. That is deeply real. It is one of those things that can also sneak up on you, because you can be having a decent day and then suddenly you're feeling this heavy, quiet guilt that you're here and someone else isn't, that you got more, that you rang that bell, and that you are trying to rebuild why other people, never got that chance. And sometimes it makes joy feel very complicated. Sometimes it makes celebration feel almost completely disloyal, and sometimes it paralyzes me a little bit. It makes me question whether I'm allowed to complain, whether I'm allowed to still struggle, whether I'm allowed to say, man, this is hard. And when the obvious answer is very yes, yeah, I am alive. Yeah, I am grateful. But there's still a huge struggle. And the truth is that both things can exist. I mean, I can be grateful and I can be grieving. I can be alive, but I can still be affected. I can celebrate and still be carrying fear. I can smile and I can still have damage. I can say I made it and also say the aftermath is real. These things, they're not contradictions. It's a new reality and it's survivorship. And that is why I wanted this anniversary episode to be as comprehensive, but also conversational and really honest. I did not want to make something that sounded polished, but very empty. I wanted this to sound lived in. I wanted it to sound like someone was sitting down 1 year later and saying, yo, this is what it really was, and this is what it is, and this is why I refuse to reduce it to a pretty little summary. Because this day deserves a lot more than that. It deserves, I deserve more than that, to be honest. And if anyone is listening out there somewhere, in their own recovery, in their own treatment, their own fear, their own grief, I kind of want them to hear that there is room for the whole truth. I want to bring in footage too, because those videos carry something words alone cannot. From day one, to not so long ago, to days that I was in the chair, to the physical reality of things, the moments where I severely suffered the loss of my hair, when my hair was falling, the visual evidence of what my body endured, and then the footage of, of when I rang the bell, because all of those moments really do matter, and to remind myself, I rung that bell, I made it, I did it, my body fought hell and back, and no matter how complicated life feels now, I just cannot let myself become so consumed by the aftermath that I forget the miracle of that fact, So I will be doing some of those clips and videos. I've honestly been kind of thinking on it a lot. I'm like, is it worth it? Do I want to relive through all of that again? And yeah, I do, and I want to share that with you. So I will be posting that up, that footage in the next coming weeks. So when those clips come in, I want them to land not as tragedy, but as testimony, as look at this, look at what I survived, and look at what the body can endure, look at what the spirit can endure. Like, look at how ugly and sacred survival can be at the same time, and even with everything, I have said today, I don't want to end in a place that feels defeated, because that wouldn't be honest either, The truth is that I do have hope, a lot of it. I do have things that I'm very excited about. I do have projects that make me feel alive. I think about my creative work now, my ideas, my projects, my magazine, my podcast, the stories that I still want to tell, the images that I still want to make, the music that I still want to make, the life that I still want to build, and I start to feel that spark again, I feel that second chance energy. Not the cheesy version, but definitely the earned version. The version that knows exactly how expensive life is beyond currency, and it still chooses to be very excited for it. I want to keep creating, I want to keep making things that make things feel beautiful and true, things that feel beautiful and true. I want to keep building my projects, I want to keep meeting people who are capable of real care and real presence. I want to keep learning how to live in this changed body without treating it only like a site of damage. I want to make room for joy without feeling guilty for it. And more than anything, I really want to reassure the people who listen to me, who support me, and who care about me that I'm here. I am here. That I really am here. Still healing, yes. Still figuring out things, yeah. Still frustrated at times, for sure. But I'm here, you know. And if anything in my story can inspire anyone, someone in the smallest, even the smallest bit possible, then that means a lot to me. If somebody hears this and feels less alone, it was worth it. If someone hears this and decides to keep on going just one more day, perfect. It matters. If someone hears this and feels seen in the middle of the ugly middle of recovery, that matters too. Inspiration does not always have to look huge. You know, sometimes it's just honesty. You know, sometimes it's just proof that survival can be complicated and still worthy of celebration, you know. So today, you know, on the 1 year anniversary of my last chemo infusion and that I rang that bell, I'm letting myself hold all of it. You know, the fear from the beginning, the diagnosis, the port, first chemo day, surgery, second round of chemo, hospitalization, the hunger, dehydration, the 1,000 calorie goal, the protonics, the damage, the neuropathy, the brain fog, the calcinosis, the lupus fears, and hopefully that just stays in fears and not just and not an answer. The lost friendships, the new people, you know, the job anxiety, the survivor's guilt, the hope, the projects, the bell. You know, I'm holding it. I'm holding all of it. And I'm saying this with my whole chest. I am way proud of myself now. I am proud that I made it. I am proud that I'm still trying. You know, I'm proud that I can speak about this with honesty and still make room for light. You know, I'm proud that even after everything, there is still something in me reaching towards life. So that's what this anniversary means to me. You know, not perfection. You know, it's I was hiding it for so long, but you know, I'm proud of this too. You know, I used to be grieving the loss of my hair that was so full and luscious. You know, and I would look at myself in the mirror and say, where did it go? You know, it's not coming back. That I was not celebrating what is coming back, you know. So yeah, no, not perfection, not closure, not some neat ending where everything is fixed, you know. It means gratitude. It means truth, you know. It means honoring what my body endured and honoring the person that I'm still becoming today. That's what this anniversary means, you know. It also means celebrating the fact that I am still alive, of course, without pretending that survival came without scars, you know. And to anybody, you know, listening who needs to hear this, whether you're sick, healing, grieving, afraid, confused, or all together, or just trying to rebuild life after everything has been knocked over, I would like for you to know that there is absolutely no shame in how complicated survival feels. You know, there's absolutely no shame in missing who you used to be while trying to love who you are now. And there's no shame in being grateful and exhausted at the same time. There's no shame in going slowly. There is no shame in needing time. I'm here. I'm still becoming. I'm still building. I'm still dreaming. I'm 37, and I'm still believing that something beautiful can come out even from this. So yeah, this has been raw and real. You know, and I'm Jhonny Jhay. And today, 1 year later, I'd like to say thank you for being here with me in this journey. Thank you for listening. And definitely thank you for letting me mark this day the way it deserves to be marked. Thanks.